My favorite Final Fantasy game is Final Fantasy IX. Though I put all the FF games that I have played on a relatively even keel in terms of their overall quality, I give 9 the slight advantage over all of them for one reason. Out of all the philosophical media I have ever encountered, 9's meditation on the debate between free will and determinism is one of the most polished, mature, and honest. To summarize, the game makes a powerful and non-preachy argument against the belief in free will, that our lives are maybe not entirely predetermined by our genetics and our environment, but largely. It's not a definitive argument, mind you, but one that is strong enough to inspire existential doubt and dread. Yet 9 beautifully offsets this dread by suggesting that the free will versus determinism debate is irrelevant in one important way. Whether I have free will or not, the life I've been given is still uniquely mine, and it will be filled with beautiful moments that are unique to my life path, especially when they are shared with the ones I love. For that reason, I owe it to myself to rise above existential dread and live my life to the fullest. Though the majority of Final Fantasy games tackle the issue of free will in a variety of powerful ways, I had yet to encounter one that, in my opinion, addressed it with the same level of optimistic potency that 9 did. Until I played Final Fantasy XVI. In many ways, the story of Final Fantasy XVI feels like a continuation of the free will debate from 9. Though it has a lot of the same points against free will, and even new ones that possess equivalent vigor, it also provides powerful counterpoints in favor of free will's existence. In a way, the entire story feels like a metaphor for the author's personal struggle between the merits of both arguments. Though 16 definitively picks a side in the free will debate, it's an opinion that I think people on the opposing side can respect, because it feels like the result of an honest contention with the issue. Now, while this stance is communicated explicitly through dialogue, there appear to be additional, subtle elements to this stance that are communicated through this game's choice of names and symbols. By pairing these explicit and subtle elements together, I believe I might have uncovered some hints regarding not only the author's belief, but also the game's biggest mysteries, including but not limited to the game's ending. I will address all of this in a moment, but before I do, I will inform those who have not completed Final Fantasy XVI that this video spoils everything in the game. If you don't want the story to be ruined for you, bookmark this video and come back to it when you're done. You have been warned. With that down and out of the way, I will transition into the game's discussion of free will by recapping the history of the game's main villain, Ultima. Towards the end of the game, we learn that Ultima and his kin are aliens that traveled to Valisthea thousands of years prior. They did this because their homeworld was destroyed via the use of magic, which caused their planet to be drained of life-sustaining ether. Seeing no other option, 16 survivors of Ultima's species left their home planet on a ship called Origin to travel to the planet of Valisthea, a land that was replete with ether. Their plan was to use this ether to revive their species, but to do that, they would need a suitable vessel to cast a revival spell called Raise. To do this, Ultima cast forward the seeds of humanity. Their plan was to have humanity evolve over thousands of years until it produced their ideal vessel, which they called Mythos. As we find out, that vessel was the main character, Clive Rosfield. To help Clive become the perfect vessel, Ultima and his kin sacrificed their physical forms to produce the Mother Crystals, which would siphon the ether from Valisthea. Eventually, Mythos would destroy the Mother Crystals and absorb the ether the Mother Crystals harvested in the form of the monstrous icons. When all the crystals were destroyed, all Ultima would need to do would be to merge with Mythos and cast the spell. With Ultima's plan, we see how tightly the shackles of determinism and fate bind human beings. Up until the last hour or two of the game, Clive completes Ultima's plan to a T. It is only when Ultima attempts to merge with Clive that his plan is foiled due to the sheer force of Clive's will. But what made Clive's will stronger than that of a god like Ultima? Here we find the game's primary retort against the ideas of determinism and fate. While waiting for humanity to evolve towards Mythos, Ultima and his kin went to sleep. Though virtually everything went according to plan over these thousands of years, there was one factor that crept up that Ultima could not account for, that being the development of individual consciousness in human beings. This type of consciousness was opposed to the collective hive mind of Ultima, and not just in its type. Unlike the blissful ignorance of collective consciousness, individual consciousness produces the ability to reflect. It allows us to become aware of the forces directing our fate, and gives us a chance to bring them under our control. The primary example of this comes early in the game when Clive discovers the truth behind what happened at Phoenix Gate many years prior. He finds out that the icon Ifrit took over his mind and almost killed his brother Joshua when he was taking the form of the icon Phoenix. This inspires a level of guilt that makes Clive beg for death. But through the love and support of people like Sid and Jill, Clive finds the will to confront this truth and remove its murderous grip on his soul. This confrontation takes a semi-literal form when Clive ventures beneath Phoenix Gate. Here, he enters a dreamlike state where he does battle with his quote-unquote shadow. It's Carl Jung. This confrontation with his shadow and the control it gives Clive over the icon Ifrit is probably the most obvious reference to Carl Jung's psychological theory that I've ever seen in a video game. In case you don't know, Jung's concept of the shadow posits that we possess dark traits which are incommensurate with our conscious personality. Thus, we push those traits into unconsciousness, a segment of our mind that Jung dubs the shadow. However, this is just a temporary solution. These unconscious contents will rise up within us from time to time and direct our behavior. As Jung states, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. In Clive's case, he makes the unconscious conscious through this confrontation with the shadow. He removes Ifrit's grip on his mind and brings it under his control. It is here that we witness the game's primary argument against the concepts of fate and determinism. It is human consciousness and the gift of reflection it confers that enables us to confront the forces that control our lives and prevent them from driving us towards an undesirable fate. Now, the question that Final Fantasy XVI attempts to answer following this moment is how far our individual wills can take us. Sure, the human will can prevent us from arriving at certain fates. But don't deterministic factors like our genetics and our environment limit the possibilities? Don't they prevent us from having truly free will? Though Final Fantasy XVI doesn't offer definitive answers in this regard, it does entertain the possibilities. Returning to the confrontation with the shadow idea, where you use your will to overcome fate, Jung believed that there was a hypothetical endpoint to this process. When all your unconscious contents are brought into consciousness, you achieve a psychological state known as the self. In simple terms, the self is the ideal version of you, a state where no deterministic factors hamper your will, a state where your will is free. Now here's something that's kind of trippy. Jung believed that the various religions of the world were unconsciously aware of this inner ideal, this self, and tried to describe it symbolically, often taking the form of their highest god. A common characteristic of these symbols is their tendency to unify opposites into a paradoxical, inconceivable union. I will point to 3 examples of this union of opposites showing up in Final Fantasy XVI. The first is the Ouroboros armor, which just so happens to be the most powerful armor in the game. The The Ouroboros is a very old depiction of this union of opposites. As you can see, the snake remains alive, yet is simultaneously consuming itself. A paradox. The second example comes with something that Joshua says near the end of the game. He notes that the only way Ultima's Mythos vessel could cast the Raise spell is if Ifrit and Phoenix were united in one, in the form of Ifrit Risen. But why this needs to happen isn't given an explicit explanation. I surmise that just like the Ouroboros is a union of creative and destructive energies, so is Ifrit Risen. It unites the creative celestial fire of the Phoenix with the infernal destructive fire of Ifrit, creating the ideal vessel for Ultima, the ideal self. The third piece of evidence is the most complicated, one that has to do with the game's Christian symbolism, of which there is a lot. Jung suggested that arguably the most famous symbol of the self was Jesus Christ. To Christians, Christ was the ideal man, and it was his representation of that ideal that people wanted to emulate. In other words, they became aware of their inner Jungian self through Jesus. He also was a union of many opposites. To cite a couple of Jung's examples, he was a god, but also a man. He is eternal, but also existed only once in time. Now, as for why this is relevant to Clive's personal development, we learn towards the end of the game that Clive's will enabled him to resist Ultima's plan. When Ultima realized how strong Clive's will was, he stopped referring to him as Mythos and started referring to him as Logos. This choice of words is unbelievably clever, for two reasons. First, the ancient Greeks used the words Mythos and Logos to describe two different types of thinking. Mythos dealt with instinctual and emotional thinking, but Logos dealt with rational and reflective thinking, a pair of opposite capacities united within one human. The second reason is the Christian use of the word Logos. Logos is the term given to the quote-unquote Word of God, God's creative speech, the words he spoke into the void at the beginning of time in order to birth the universe. Additionally, as we find out in the Gospels and the Book of Revelation, the Logos incarnates in one perfect form, and that form is Jesus. In effect, what Ultima is calling Clive is both Jesus and the rational side of human beings. By having Clive integrate his shadow and the subsequent icons, which are also mental contents that take physical form, he can achieve the highest ideal, and by proxy, cultivate a will strong enough to kill a god. It is through this will that he can bring the era of gods, of mythos and mythology to an end, and usher in an age of reason, of Logos. To conclude, I will try to bring things back to this video's original topic, which was the power of the human will and its potential limits. If we embody the self, if our will becomes truly free and bound by no constraint, what would be the number one thing we would do with this will? It would be the same thing that Ultima wanted to do with his kin, the same thing that made Jesus, at least in part, the ideal man. That would be the will to transcend death. Obviously, the biggest mystery regarding the end of the game is Joshua and Clive's ultimate fate. No pun intended. Does Joshua come back to life? Does Clive survive? Or does he die and then come back to life? Or are they both okay? The book we see in the end credits scene with Joshua's name written on it suggests a few things. Maybe Joshua did come back to life. Or maybe Clive came back to life, but he wrote the book under Joshua's name. Examples that support Clive's survival and/or revival include Harpocrates giving Clive his quill, as well as Jill persistently voicing her wish for Clive to return to her. Personally, I believe that, at the very least, one of the two came back to life. Follow my logic here. As I'm sure we're all well aware, Jesus' most famous act was rising from the dead after his crucifixion on the cross. Now, the cross symbol and the act of resurrection is hinted at in many ways. One of the lesser examples is the name of one of the areas in the game, which is the Lazarus District. Lazarus was the name of a man whom Jesus resurrected after he died. As for the evidence that Joshua resurrected, he wore crosses on his clothes in his youth. Plus, there's a reference to Jesus in the name Joshua. Jesus' name in Hebrew was Yeshua, and if you translate Yeshua to English, you get the name Joshua. If I were a betting man, I would bet that Clive, out of love for his brother, subsumed Ultima's power and revived him. But there's enough beautiful ambiguity here that I could easily have my mind changed. I call this ambiguity beautiful because it amplifies the game's celebration of the human will. By not confirming but merely suggesting the possibility of resurrection, the game forces the player to address their belief in the strength of the human will. Can the human will be strong enough to throw off the shackles of fate and achieve a will that was truly free? One that not even death can restrain? If we collectively believe in something, could we will it into existence, as the man in the Inconvenient Truth side quest suggests? If we're talking about our world, I will take the safe bet and say probably not, but there is one thing that is certain. As long as we have the ability to choose and to persevere, and we have the love and support of our friends and family, then almost anything can be possible. Clive illustrates this fact towards the end of the game when talking to Joshua. Joshua laments that freedom from Ultima's influence might just be a new shackle to be broken. To this, Clive says maybe, but a chain can always be broken, as long as one has the will to break it. It won't be easy. It may take generations, centuries of suffering, and that is if everyone plays their part. But it will happen, and when it does, it will be on our terms. It will be a consequence of our will. If you liked this video, please give it a like. That helps me out a great deal. Special thanks to Nick Kovitz for helping me with the script for this video, and special thanks to Indy for the thumbnail artwork. If you want to see more in-depth analysis of the Final Fantasy games, click on either of the two videos you see on screen now. Until next time, stay yellow.